What you know about the 4th of July is almost completely wrong. On July 4th, the holiday was illegal for decades, and the American government crimes. The Liberty Bell was never called that during the Revon the same day. Here are 22 facts that official history tried to erase about America's biggest holiday. Fact 1. Everyone learned in school that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1796. But that's not exactly what happened. On that day, the Continental Congress only approved the final text of the document. No one picked up a pen to sign the parchment. The actual signing came almost a month later, on August 2nd, during a ceremony in Philadelphia. And not all 56 men signed it together. Several of them were not even in the city on July 4th. Some added their names weeks later, others only months later, and some say the last person did not sign until the following year. The parchment that is still on display today, with all those signatures lined up, gives the impression that everything happened at once. It didn't. The date printed on the document became a symbol of the country, but the act it represents dragged on for months in separate sessions, with different men picking up the pen on different days. Fact 2. John Adams spent decades annoyed by the 4th of July. To him, America was celebrating on the wrong day, and he had his reasons. On July 2nd, 1796, the Continental Congress formally voted for independence. That was the day the colonies officially cut ties with England. The declaration everyone knows was only approved 2 days later, on July 4th. To Adams, the vote was what mattered. The document was just paper. He was so convinced of this that he wrote to his wife, Abigail, saying that July 2nd would be remembered for generations as America's great anniversary. He described fireworks, celebrations, everything tied to that date. But history took a different path. The 4th of July became the national holiday, and Adams never accepted it. In the final years of his life, he turned down invitations to 4th of July parties and ceremonies. He died in 1826, on July 4th itself, still believing that the entire country was celebrating on the wrong day. Fact 3. The Declaration wasn't read to the public until July 8th. Think about it. Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1796. But the average person on the street? They didn't find out that day. The first public reading did not happen until 4 days later, on July 8th, in the courtyard of the Pennsylvania State House, which we now know as Independence Hall. Up until that moment, the people of Philadelphia had no idea that the country had declared independence. And outside the city, the situation was even worse. News depended on messengers traveling on horseback, so communities in rural Pennsylvania took weeks to receive the information. George Washington did not announce the news to his troops in New York until July 9th, 5 days after it was approved. In other words, that image we have of an entire country celebrating on July 4th is something that was created later. In reality, independence arrived little by little, from town to town, from camp to camp. Fact 4. John Adams wrote to his wife on July 6, 1796, saying that date would be celebrated by future generations as the great day of independence. And he was right, at least technically. On that day, the Continental Congress voted on and approved the Lee Resolution, the document that officially cut ties with Great Britain. 12 colonies voted yes, while New York stayed on the fence and only ratified it a week later. So, what happened on July 4th? Congress approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence, which was basically the edited and revised version of the document, explaining to the world the reasons for the separation. It was more of a political manifesto than the legal act itself. Independence had actually already been decided 2 days earlier. Thomas Jefferson himself also considered July 2nd the true date. But history took a different path, and July 4th became the holiday everyone knows. The question that remains is, have Americans been celebrating on the wrong day for nearly 250 years? Fact 5. Did you know that for nearly 100 years, the 4th of July was not an official holiday? That's right. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1796, but Congress did not recognize the date as a federal holiday until June 1870. That is a 94-year difference. During all that time, federal government employees worked as usual on July 4th. There was no day off guaranteed by law. Each state decided on its own whether to celebrate it or not. Some held parties and parades, while others simply ignored the date. The change only came after the Civil War, when the country had been split in two. The government needed symbols that could bring the North and South back together. So they created a package of federal holidays that included not only the 4th of July, but also Christmas and New Year's Day. It was a political move to rebuild the national identity. In other words, America's most patriotic holiday was born not out of pure patriotism, but out of the need to put the pieces of a divided country back together. Fact 6. For more than 160 years after independence, most Americans worked on the 4th of July. That's right. The holiday had officially existed on paper since 1870, when the federal government recognized the date. But there was one detail no one talks about. It was an unpaid holiday. If you worked in a factory, a store, or on a farm, taking the day off meant losing that day's pay. Simple as that. No one was going to have a picnic knowing money would be tight at the end of the month. The change only came in 1938 during the New Deal labor reforms, when Roosevelt signed laws guaranteeing paid holidays for federal workers. That classic image we know today, families gathered in the backyard, cold beer, burgers on the grill, and fireworks at night, is a 20th century thing. Before that, the 4th of July as a paid day off simply did not exist for most people. The great American holiday everyone celebrates today was built on a fight for workers' rights that took place during one of the worst economic crises in the country's history. Fact 7. When Vicksburg fell to General Grant, it was July 4th, 1863. The entire city surrendered on Independence Day itself. For the residents, that date became a symbol of humiliation. And what happened next? They simply stopped celebrating the holiday. Not for a year or two, for 84 straight years, there were no official 4th of July celebrations. The city did not observe the date again until 1947. But Vicksburg was not alone. In several parts of Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, entire communities boycotted the festivities for decades. For many people in the South, the 4th of July did not represent freedom. It represented defeat and military occupation. What finally changed the situation was the Cold War. With the United States trying to present itself to the world as a model of democracy, it became difficult to explain why parts of the country itself refused to celebrate its founding. Federal pressure grew, and by the 1950s, the last pockets of resistance began to give in. Fact 8. In 1812, the United States went to war against England for the second time. British troops crossed the border from Canada and advanced on several fronts. The federal government made a decision no one expected. It asked coastal cities to cancel their 4th of July celebrations. The fear was real. British ships were patrolling the coast, and any large gathering could become a target. In 1813, the request was made again, but the worst was still to come. In August 1814, British soldiers marched straight into Washington, D.C. and set fire to the main government buildings, the Capitol, the White House, and the U.S. Treasury were burned. President Madison had to flee the Capitol in a hurry. Weeks before that attack, dozens of cities had already celebrated the 4th of July in silence. No fireworks, no speeches, no parades. The holiday that celebrated independence turned 38 with the nation's capital literally in ashes. Fact 9. Between 1903 and 1909, more than 1,200 Americans died during the celebrations. Did you know the 4th of July was once the most dangerous day of the year for an American? Not because of any war or attack, because of the celebration itself. Between 1903 and 1909, the New York Times published a list every year of the people killed and injured during the celebrations, and the numbers were horrifying. In 1903 alone, there were 496 deaths and more than 4,000 injuries. Accidental shootings, homemade fireworks, gunpowder explosions, people dying from poisoning. There was so much tragedy that the American Medical Association launched an official campaign in 1905 calling for changes. They called the holiday a Carnival of Death. Hospitals across the country sent petitions to Congress describing what happened in emergency rooms during the holiday. Doctors begged for regulations. It took years before cities began banning homemade fireworks and restricting civilian use of gunpowder. Before that, every 4th of July was Russian roulette disguised as a celebration. Fact 10. By 1911, more than 100 American cities had already banned fireworks for personal use. This did not happen out of nowhere. Starting in 1903, a group of doctors and reformers launched a campaign called the Safe and Sane 4th of July. The reason was simple. Every year, the 4th of July left behind a trail of mutilated children, burned down homes, and deaths. Places like Chicago, Boston, Detroit, and Cincinnati were among the first to take action. The main targets were Roman candles and firecrackers, which caused most of the fatalities. The logic was straightforward. If the holiday exists to celebrate freedom, it makes no sense for it to kill Americans every summer. The cities did not eliminate fireworks completely. Professional shows were still allowed. What became illegal was ordinary people setting off explosives in the street with no control at all. The model we know today, where people go to a public fireworks show instead of setting them off in their backyards, was born directly from that wave of bans in the early 20th century. Fact 11. Until the end of the 19th century, local militias had a habit of positioning real cannons in public squares to celebrate the 4th of July. And we are not talking about fireworks or blank rounds. They were firing real gunpowder in the middle of residential areas packed with families. The problem was that those cannons were not always aimed correctly. When the angle was off, projectiles tore through windows, struck walls, and fell into unsuspecting crowds. In Boston, municipal records from 1870 document 3 pedestrians killed during a single ceremonial salute for the holiday. In Baltimore in 1884, a 21-gun salute honoring the date left 4 people seriously injured. And these were not isolated cases. City after city piled up reports of similar accidents. It was only after the death toll became impossible to ignore that authorities gradually began banning the practice. Before that, no one questioned the idea of firing heavy artillery just a few feet from where children were playing. Fact 12. In the 19th century, local militias were in charge of the fireworks on the 4th of July. They were basically groups of volunteers with no formal training. No one required certification, and no one supervised anything. And here is the detail that changes everything. These guys showed up to the event already drunk. It was tradition to drink all day before handling gunpowder. The gunpowder itself came from anywhere, with no quality standards at all, and everyone brought their own. The result was predictable. In Philadelphia, In 1888, a militia demonstration exploded out of control and injured 22 people who were just watching. 2 years later, the Boston Journal of Medicine documented 34 cases of severe burns on a single 4th of July, all caused by these amateur demonstrations. The medical journal itself used a phrase that says it all. It called the situation a self-inflicted national catastrophe. For decades, Americans celebrated independence by handing explosives to drunk, untrained men, and no one thought it was strange. Fact 13. In 1894, while the entire country was celebrating the 4th of July, U.S. Army soldiers opened fire on striking workers. This was not a foreign war. It was the government shooting its own people. The story began weeks earlier. Workers at the Pullman Company, which manufactured railroad cars, lived in a town built by the company itself. They lived in company-owned houses, shopped at company-owned stores, and their wages were barely enough to cover the rent charged by the company. When wages were cut without lowering the rent, the workers walked off the job. Eugene Debs organized a nationwide railroad strike in solidarity. President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops. On Independence Day, soldiers fired on American civilians. 30 people were killed, 57 were injured. Debs was arrested, and here's the detail few people know. To calm tensions, Cleveland created Labor Day in September. He deliberately chose a date as far away from the 4th of July as possible, so no one would associate workers' rights with that massacre. Fact 14. During Prohibition, the federal government saw the 4th of July as the best opportunity of the year to catch people drinking. Think about that. The day that celebrates American freedom became federal agents' favorite day to raid people's homes. The Bureau of Prohibition sent undercover agents into barbecues, neighborhood parties, and club gatherings across the country. In Chicago, on July 4, 1921, the Tribune reported that federal agents entered 47 private homes in a single day. The homeowners were arrested for serving alcohol to their own friends inside their own living rooms. These were not speakeasies or gangsters. They were family men having barbecues in their backyards. This kind of action became powerful ammunition for the movement against Prohibition. The argument practically made itself. How could a government arrest citizens inside their own homes on the exact day the country celebrates its independence? For many people, that was when it became clear that Prohibition had gone too far. Fact 15. In 1942, the 4th of July almost did not happen across much of the country. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the government imposed blackout rules along the entire East Coast. The reason was very real. German submarines were operating near the American shoreline and using the glow of cities at night as a reference point to locate and sink merchant ships. From Maine to Florida, entire cities were forced to turn off every light after dark. No fireworks, no outdoor parties once night fell. Many towns simply canceled their traditional parades. Along nearly 3,000 miles of coastline, America's loudest holiday passed in almost complete silence. And here is the part that makes you think the country was entering a war in the name of freedom, but it had to silence the very celebration that honors that freedom. That was the real price that generation paid before even setting foot on a battlefield. Fact 16. You know that under God in the Pledge of Allegiance that seems like it has always been there? Well, it was only added in 1954. The original pledge was written in 1892 by a man named Francis Bellamy, who, interestingly enough, was a socialist. The original text said, "One nation, indivisible," and stopped there, without mentioning God at any point. For more than 60 years, generations of Americans recited the pledge without those two words. Then came the Cold War. Congress decided it needed something to set the United States apart from the Soviet Union, which was officially atheist. The solution was to insert "under God" into the middle of the pledge in June 1954. It was not a decision based on tradition or faith. It was purely a political strategy against communism. What many people today treat as something sacred and untouchable is basically Cold War propaganda that is only 70 years old. To top it off, Bellamy's own family has publicly stated that he would have opposed this change to the text he created. Fact 17. 2 presidents of the United States died on the same day, and it was not just any day. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were political rivals for decades, but before that, they worked together to create the Declaration of Independence in 1776. 50 years later, on July 4, 1826, Jefferson died at his estate in Virginia around noon. Adams died in Massachusetts a few hours later, in the late afternoon. The chilling detail is that Adams did not know Jefferson had already passed away. His last recorded words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." When the news spread across the country, people were shocked. Mathematicians calculated that the odds of 2 former presidents dying on the same day, on the 50th anniversary of the document they both helped write, were approximately 1 in 133,000. Newspapers at the time treated it as a divine sign that the American Republic had been blessed by heaven. Fact 18. You already know that Adams and Jefferson died on the same 4th of July. But the story did not end there. 5 years later, in 1831, James Monroe, the 5th president, also died on July 4th. 3 of the first 5 American presidents died on the same calendar date. Monroe was 73 years old and living in New York with his daughter after his wife passed away. His health had been getting worse for months, but the timing of his death left the entire country stunned once again. Newspapers at the time treated it almost like a divine sign, as if the Republic had some kind of supernatural connection to that date. Now think about this. What are the mathematical odds of 3 out of 5 people dying on the same day of the year? Statisticians calculated it at around 1 in 133,000. There is no official explanation. No serious historian has been able to come up with a reason that fully makes sense. Pure coincidence? Maybe. But it is the kind of coincidence that makes any reasonable person stop and think twice. Fact 19. The famous painting of the signing is completely fabricated. You know that huge painting in the Capitol showing the Founding Fathers gathered together, signing the Declaration of Independence? Well, that never happened that way. John Trumbull painted the scene between 1817 and 1819, more than 40 years after the actual event. The painting shows 47 men together in the same room, as if they had all signed the document at the same time. But in real life, the signatures were collected over several months, from August through November 1796, in separate sessions. Several of the men shown standing side by side were never in that room at the same time. Some of them never even met in person. And here's the part that really gets you. It was the U.S. Congress itself that commissioned and approved the painting. In other words, the government looked at a made-up scene and said, "Yeah, go ahead," and put it in the Capitol as the official record. The most famous image of American independence is, in practice, a work of fiction approved by the very people who were supposed to preserve the real history. Fact 20. The Liberty Bell did not have that name during the Revolution. That bell every American associates with the 4th of July. During the Revolution, no one called it the Liberty Bell. It was just the State House bell, the bell in Pennsylvania's government building. Nothing special. And that story about it ringing when independence was declared in 1776, There is no record from the time confirming it. 0. The name Liberty Bell did not appear until 1835, nearly 60 years after the Revolution. And it was not patriots who gave the bell that name. It was abolitionists fighting against slavery. They took the inscription engraved in the bronze, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land," and turned it into a slogan for the anti-slavery movement. The famous crack? It appeared in 1846, 70 years after independence. So basically, the most recognizable symbol of American freedom did not gain that meaning because of the Revolution. It gained it because of the fight to end slavery. The story most people know was created decades after the events it supposedly represents.